Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of New Books in Intellectual History, part of the New Books Network. I'm your host, Thomas Edward Kingston, and today I'm joined by Professor Jeremy Friedman, who is the Associate Professor in Business Administration at Harvard Business School. We're going to be talking about his new book, Ripe for Revolution, Building Socialism in the Third World, which is out now by Harvard University Press. I personally found this book an incredibly interesting read, both based on my personal interests and on touching on many subjects that I wasn't aware of these countries that are so often overlooked. I think what crucially shone in this book to me was a very different understanding of socialism and how we need to adapt beyond the binary we often see, either East-West or internally in terms of Soviet and Chinese. So it's really great to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Thomas.
So let's go in at the deep end. Why did you write this book?
Well, besides a certain strain of masochism, I think, when it comes to archival research, I think that the major impetus was that I felt there's sort of an inadequacy thus far in the historiography on socialism. And I think the way we tend to write about socialism and movements on the left as if they are sort of individualistic responses to different phenomena in different times and places, and don't have kind of a coherence across space and time. So I think, for example, we tend to write about Soviet interventions in the developing world during the Cold War as if these are episodes of Soviet foreign policy or competition with China or things like that. And there is no sort of overall idea of how socialism as a project evolves across space and time. So we have this evolving field of history of capitalism. And history of capitalism, we understand, of course, that capitalism not only is it difficult to pin down sort of theoretically what the original institutions are or what it means, but capitalism is not the same in all spaces and times. And yet there is something to the idea that given that everyone is part of a certain system, and that there are institutions and ideologies and ideas that cross borders, that there is this kind of learning developing process that happens internationally. And so that's kind of the core of history of capitalism. History of socialism, I think socialism needs to be seen in a similar manner. So, for example, having written this book, I was emailed by someone who wrote a review or said they wrote a review, and I didn't get to see much of the review, but I saw the first couple lines, and I saw right away he said building, in scare quotes, so-called socialism. And at that point, I immediately knew there was a problem with the review because the point is there's no so-called socialism. Just like if someone were looking at Sven Beckert's book Empire of Cotton and said, well, this is so-called capitalism, right? Because real capitalism involves free labor and free markets and perfect information. And, here you have, coercion and violence, and, that's not real capitalism. We'll be looking at and say, well, that's absurd, right? You have a textbook idea of how capitalism is supposed to work, but in reality, this is how capitalism has actually functioned. That's sort of, the attitude we have to take towards understanding socialism is that, yes, we have textbook ideas of how socialism is supposed to work, but that's not how it's ever actually functioned in practice. And it can be perfected over time. But as historians, right, our job is not to, look at the purest version of the ideology. Our job is to look at how it's actually evolved. And so I think the first thing I wanted to do was create this, and it's a difficult thing to create an international history of socialism. Because it involves lots of archives and lots of languages, and I was very, very lucky in writing this book that I got access to things in China that are no longer accessible. I went to Russia at just the right time in 2019. Certainly, I don't know the next time I'll be doing research in Moscow. So there are difficulties involved here, but the idea that socialism is a global project in which all the various entities that consider themselves as building socialism are really in conversation. In this process of trial and error, and that the versions of socialism that we have now, and socialism is still very much, a live phenomenon, not just, in the Chinese Communist Party in its version of it, or, in Cuba or somewhere else, but in terms of what's happening politically in the United States, in the UK, in Europe, right? Socialism is probably more alive now politically in the United States than it has been at any point since, at least the 1960s, if not the 1930s. And the version of socialism we have now is not the same as what it was in the Soviet Union in the 1930s or in China in the 1960s. But there is a lineage. There is, a way to trace the evolution. And so there's a relationship. And I think, it's important for us to understand that sort of global process of experimentation and trial and error and evolution. And that's I think the real impetus behind writing a book like this.
And I think that's something that really shines through in this because I suppose it strikes me as kind of odd when we see the Chinese and the Soviets navigating these various forms of socialism, and they're engaging with them to varying levels, but they're understanding there is this sort of socialist or along those lines, or what they can see as socialist bedrock underneath all of this. And these are people that we would, parties, people, organizations that we would often see as like super ideologically pure. And yet they're engaging with it. And then, as you point out, there has been this sort of lack of, shall we say, open-minded or inclusive engagement, and like I said, a very purist approach that's based upon ideology. And I think that's actually something that, and I'm going back to front here, and because this comes out in the conclusion, but you talk about ideology in quite a different way to how it's commonly understood in the book. And I think it would help the readers if you just give us a little brief outline of that.
Well, again, I think the way ideology has usually been treated in history and political science is as there's sort of binary. You're either ideological or you're pragmatic or you're realist or something along those lines. And ideological, especially the way it's used, I think, in sort of the contemporary United States is almost as a synonym for irrational. That someone is ideological, meaning they're making choices that are based on sort of, phantoms that they're, stuck in their heads. And I think that, and this leads us to sort of conclude that, well, if in order to prove that a political leader is ideological, we sort of say, well, if you believe in this ideology, you would do the following, 5 things. And if they're doing the following 5 things, then we know they're ideological. And if they deviate from those 5 things, and they're somehow pragmatic or realist or cynical. And I think that's sort of a misunderstanding of how ideology actually works. So the point is, that again, if you look at the history of capitalism, there are certain works, especially on the history of sort of, capitalist countries' aid in the developing world, in the 1960s, 1970s. And there's an increasing awareness that, they adapted things like state-led development and planning that we wouldn't associate with capitalism, but they thought, well, this is how it has to work here. And eventually through this, you will get back towards private investment. And so there's, the kind of ways of manipulating the ideology or, massaging certain of its tenets in order to achieve the greater objective in the end. And yet somehow when it comes to the socialist side, we've sort of looked at this and said, well, this means that they didn't really believe, they weren't really communists and such. So I have a different model. I argue in the conclusion that what ideology really is a systematically simplified method for understanding reality that facilitates judgment and action. The idea basically is that reality as it is infinitely complicated. And if we try to assimilate reality in all of its complexities, we'd be paralyzed by indecision. And so what we do is we pick out the parts of reality that are most salient. Right? In any situation, we say, what matters here? What doesn't matter here? Who's responsible for this? And so, we think about, picking apart kind of, the idea of things that are phenomenal, epiphenomenal. Class identity is fundamental. Racial identity is epiphenomenal, or the other way around, right? Or gender is fundamental, and something else is epiphenomenal. And so these are really kind of the stories that, motivate our understanding of the world and what's happening. And it doesn't mean that, because you have a certain understanding of the world, that necessitates a certain action. It facilitates judgment and action because it makes it easier for you to understand, okay, well, this is what's happening, right? This is what I should do, or this is what I could do. But how, right, that understanding translates into policy is filtered through, beliefs, capabilities, and interests. So, for example, you might not like, you might feel like, a war that's happening, let's say in Algeria or Vietnam, is another instance of, capitalist imperialism attempting to impose its will on a colonial peoples. But if your belief is that if I engage in this war, it might lead to nuclear war, that's still going to impact your decision as to whether or not you send in troops to Vietnam or Algeria, which did for the Soviets. Capabilities matters too. So if you're the Chinese and you say, right, that we think that the missiles should remain in Cuba, right, that it would be a mistake to remove the missiles from Cuba, but you don't have the capability to send your own forces halfway the world to Cuba, right, then that's also going to impact what you can actually do in that situation. And then, of course, their interests, right? If you're Yugoslavia and you're afraid of what it means to have Soviet troops in your backyard in Hungary, that might affect how you react to the Soviet invasion of Hungary. So the point is that you can making these decisions does not mean that you have betrayed your ideology. It does not mean that you're merely cynical or pragmatic and betrayed your ideology. You can still maintain your ideology and make different decisions. And so people with the same ideology or similar ideologies can come to different policy conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that seems especially relevant in a lot of sort of contemporary political debates we see where we seem to have the binary that is often, the more the government does things, the more socialist it is. And then on the other side, we might have this extremely purist point of view that is, well, it's not actually real socialism because it isn't as it was expressed in the work of Marx, and it doesn't fit this very specific process. And I think that leads us very well into why you picked these countries that are, but for many people, might not seem to have very obvious links. They're across 3 continents. I mean, as the book suggests, what they have in common is that they are in what would be called in, common parlance, the third world. But they're very different in terms of their background, their histories, and the leaders even, and their paths of development. So we'll talk about the individual examples later, but briefly, why these countries?
Well, so I feel like I could have picked many more countries. I could have picked, part of the importance of the story is that it really touched just about every country in what was then called the Third World, what we now more commonly would call the Global South. Almost every single country. So I could have picked, I was actually urged by some of my reviewers, why isn't there a chapter on Nicaragua? And why isn't there a chapter on Ghana? And I would have loved to write a Nicaragua chapter, but, HUP only gives you 135,000 words. So there are limitations in these things. But, so on the one hand, it could have included almost every country in the developing world, which is why this is such an important story, right? It's not limited to really a few outliers. I picked these particular 5 countries. So, part of it was just that these 5 countries sort of cover both the geographical and chronological scope of the Cold War. So, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, 2 in Sub-Saharan Africa, 1 in Latin America, and really beginning with the late 1940s and ending in the early 1980s. So in an important sense, given the timing, these are not really cases in that they're parallel, but they're actually episodes. They're sequential. And that goes to my notion of process and trial and errors. They really build on one another over time. But I picked these 5 countries also because they're each sort of paradigmatic of certain key questions that were seen to have broad relevance. So, how do you build socialism in a country with a predominantly agrarian economy? How do you build socialism in a country with a democratic political system? How do you build socialism in a country in which religion and religious authorities have a tremendous amount of social and political power? These are all major considerations that weren't relevant to just one country at one time, but relevant to many countries. And the countries I picked were sort of paradigmatic. And each of these countries, was paradigmatic, not just in the sense of, answering or seen to being answered as one question, but also because there was a period of time in which it really was at the center of sort of global attention. So, Angola is not a place a lot of people have been to. It's not a place most people think about on a daily basis. But in the winter of 1975, 1976, Angola was kind of this, center stage in terms of, geopolitics. It was on the front page of the New York Times regularly. Chile also, right? Chile might not be the first place people think of, but in 1973, Chile was, center of mind. And so these were each countries which at one particular period of time did sort of become kind of, center of the global arena.
Yeah. And I think that's quite interesting. As you say, people don't often think about these countries. And I think often if they do think about these countries within sort of the socialist paradigm, it's often through a very different framing. And this brings us to the first country, Indonesia, which has seen a recent uptick, maybe the last 10 years or so, in focusing what's being described as as genocide or a democide, or indisputably mass killings is a straightforward way, which is obviously the downfall of the Communist Party and many other people who were obviously actually unrelated to that. But I think that what a lot of people look at in this thing is they miss out on the rise of it and as you say, the potential it had. And that's something that really shines through in that chapter, is that this was not something that many people expected to just go away, and it played a big role in a geopolitical in the framing at that time in a very important part of the world.
Yeah, so I mean, Indonesia. The reason I picked Indonesia, and the reason I started with Indonesia, is that so the Indonesian Communist Party was the largest non-ruling communist party in the world at the time. We tend to think about the importance of, for example, the French Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party. Indonesia, by 1965, according to some estimates, if you include, so it had a population of roughly 100 million people. It was also one of the most populous countries in the world, right after the US, the USSR, China, and India. It's number 5. 100 million people, the Communist Party plus its affiliate organization, so the trade unions, the women's organization, the youth organization, and such, estimated to have between 20 and 25 million members. So roughly, 1/5 to 1/4 of the entire country, an enormous amount of people. And it was really the most important, most well-organized political force in the world's 5th largest country, which also happened to be strategically important, given its basically controls the sea lanes between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. It was an important player, not just in the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but also in the Sino-Soviet split between China and the USSR. So it's really this sort of key strategic country, which has this Communist Party that is a dominant political player that seems perpetually on the verge of gaining power, but never quite gets there. And because of the size of the country, its diversity, it combines so many of the most important elements. It sets up a lot of these important questions. So it is a primarily agrarian country, which relies to a certain degree on natural resources, which it doesn't process itself. And so there's a question of industrializing the economy and developing the economy. At the same time, it is a predominantly Islamic country. It is a country where Islamic organizations have a tremendous amount of power and really sort of dominate the countryside in many parts of the country. And so religion is a major element. It is a country that, it's a post-colonial state. It actually fought for its independence. And that fight for independence was seen as being incomplete because New Guinea was still in the hands of the Dutch. Malaysia was seen as this British conspiracy. Later on, it would conquer East Timor as well. So it's this, struggle for independence against imperialism that is still seen as being in progress. So in many ways, right, it sort of combines a lot of and then the key element on top of all that is that it was between, in the 1950s, it was this democratic multi-party regime, which then becomes consolidated under this charismatic, radical, left-wing anti-imperialist leader, Sukarno, who is sort of, a paradigmatic example in many ways of precisely this kind of, radical anti-imperialist autocrat, which, we see in other parts of the developing world in this period, the Soviets would often have to deal with, people like Nasser, for example. And so Indonesia really combines many of these key questions and a lot of, what happens in Indonesia and then what goes wrong in Indonesia. Because as you point out, right, I believe that, the term that tends to be used now is politicide, which, the killing of, what were believed to be members of a political organization on a mass scale. We're talking about 500,000 people. This is one of the largest mass killings in the 20th century. And it's rarely mentioned, it seems, outside of Indonesia, although in Indonesia, it's very much contemporary politics. I think that's true for all 5 countries in this book is, to people in the West, perhaps this seems like ancient history. To people in these countries, even in Chile, for example, we'll get to Chile, they just elected a young president, 36 years old. But the election seemed very much about, relitigating Allende versus Pinochet from the 1970s before the president was even born. So these politics are very much alive. And Indonesia, right, the politics of 1965 and the PKI are still very much alive, right? In contemporary elections, insults about being communist or pro-Chinese are still thrown around. And so I think this is, it's this tremendously important story, which ends in this great tragedy that sort of foreshadows a lot of the major questions that the book takes up going forward.
Yeah, and we see this sort of a lot of these things playing out, as you say. For example, you talk about the role of China in this, and for example, in Indonesia, the Chinese, like in many parts of Southeast Asia, are a market dominant minority, but obviously within a sort of socialist or a communist outlook, these are not sort of the people that you would necessarily be automatically recruiting, because these are very much capitalists within a sort of Marxian framework. And then obviously there is this notion of ethnic Chinese versus being Chinese passport holder as well in this sort of thing. And obviously that complicates things a bit. So, I mean, and this is something that plays out throughout the book, is that there is this sort of toing and froing before the Sino-Soviet split even between these different models. And I think one of the sort of most interesting things that comes out of the Indonesia chapter is that you talk about, with the sort of downfall of it, that pretty much wipes out the chances of China having a major role in like big countries. And it also shifts, and I think that's something that's really interesting about how you frame this, is that yes, you have the story of the individual countries, but there are also these reflections and lessons that are learned as we go along by the sort of, shall we say, spectating powers. I mean, in terms of Indonesia, what is the big lesson for the Soviet bloc and the, shall we say, the left leaning world?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call them spectating countries. I think obviously the Soviets, the Chinese, others were very much involved in Indonesia. And they all take various lessons out, and they're not always the same lesson. I think the Soviets, several key lessons. One is that, they have to take religion a lot more seriously. That, one of the sort of Achilles heels of socialism in the developing world is precisely its association with atheism. And it's being seen as being anti-religious, and, in parts of the world where lots of people are religious, and not only are religious in a private sense, but in which religious institutions have a lot of public power, political power. And so that was seen as being one of the flaws, because ultimately a lot of the actual killing in Indonesia wasn't done by the Indonesian military itself, but was being done by Islamic, rural organizations against, local communist activists who were seen as, trying to seize lands from Awqaf and things like that, from, mosques and religious trusts. And so one lesson was that, socialism has to be much more adroit and, willing to work with religious authorities, which had different sorts of consequences in Iran, as we'll get to. That's one lesson. The second lesson was actually, honestly, the importance of democracy. The Soviets had, when Sukarno overthrew the parliamentary regime, saying that, he was going to have guided democracy, was what he called it. The Soviets are actually supportive of this and pushed the PKI to support the transition to guided democracy from parliamentary democracy. And they thought that this would be because Sukarno himself, without, the sort of pressure from the bourgeois parties, would be able to have an accelerated path towards socialism, given centralized political authority. And so they pushed the Communist Party to support this. And of course, it ended up with Sukarno, being overthrown by the military, and this leading to, there were no sort of democratic freedoms to fall back on. And so, the military sort of ran roughshod over the Communist Party. And this changed by the time we get to Chile, which we'll get to soon. In Chile, the Soviets actually decide that preserving bourgeois democracy, preserving constitutionalism is actually important. It's an important safeguard, so that, the military doesn't have free rein to sort of destroy the left. So that's another, important lesson here. And at the same time, not necessarily to trust kind of the radical left-wing, nationalist figure, the Sukarno type, when you see it somewhere else, if the person is not a true socialist. So those are some of the key lessons. I think an interesting lesson as well for sort of the reader is, the nature of communist parties and what communist parties are. So, there's always been an argument whether communist parties are simply tools of international communism, or whether they're instead, domestic political parties. And are they really international actors or not? And I think one thing, you look at the Indonesian story and the relationship between the Soviet Communist Party and the Indonesian Communist Party, it sort of comes out they're kind of like on the franchise model. You think about sort of the owner of a local McDonald's, and in the sense that yes, they're locally owned and they're responsive to local conditions, but they're also susceptible to pressures from corporate headquarters, which is ultimately looking after the global brand of communism. How what's happening in Indonesia will affect the global brand of communism, and so there are responsibilities, but also obligations on both sides. So these are all, I think, lessons that come out of Indonesia. The Soviets, of course, like to blame the Indonesian tragedy on the Chinese, and the Chinese took different lessons away from Indonesia.
Yeah, I think that is a theme throughout the book as well, about this adapting to local conditions, and that's obviously used as part of the rhetoric by Sukarno for even introducing guided democracy. He talks about this: there's no need for this sort of confrontational politics; instead, decisions should be made together. And as you say, when there is this religious issue that arises in Indonesia with the Communist Party, they decide that actually maybe they're going to pick up some more supporters amongst the more sort of syncretic or less modernist groups. And I think that's something that then comes into the next country, Chile, in a quite different way. I mean, you open with this quote about Allende says about how the revolution is going to be of a very very Chilean characteristics, with red wine, and I think he talks about red wine and empanadas. As you say, it maybe is a bit of a dinner party to go against the more famous quote. But then I think the other crucial thing about Chile is that it's a very different country politically and economically to pretty much every other country in the book, right? Which makes it even more interesting.
Yeah, so Chile is, it's a key country for many reasons. First of all, there's because of the nature of, as you say, the politics and the economy, it is a multi-party democracy. It is it does have a constitution that's been in place since the 1830s. And at the same time, it's also a mixed economy. So it has more of a balance between industry and agriculture than the other countries in this book. And so for that reason, it's seen, especially by the Soviets, as offering potentially a model beyond the Cold War stalemate towards social transformation in the West. Because it has a tradition of Christian democracy, it has constitutionalism, it has a mixed economy, and so the problem is that once the Cold War sort of crystallizes in Europe, the largest communist parties, right, are in France and Italy, but there's no chance of the West allowing Soviet troops to march into Paris or march into Rome the way they march into Budapest or Warsaw, and so revolution is not going to happen that way. Communism will not spread that way, but right, there's always this chance that, there has to be an electoral path to power, right? Somehow, right, the French Communist Party forms a coalition, gets enough votes, or the Italians do this. And so that seems the only way. But, right, it hasn't happened. And there's always a question of, can you actually get there? Can you really make revolution just through parliamentary means? Or would you have to make so many compromises that by the time, you got to power, the agenda would be unrecognizable? And so Chile is this example of, a relatively Western, right? It is in the Western Hemisphere. It is in Latin America. It is primarily Catholic, and it does have more industries. So for all these reasons, it seems like more of a potential model for the rest of Latin America and for, what one might call Latin Europe, right? France, Italy, Spain, as to how you get to socialism without a violent revolution, because it doesn't seem like a violent revolution is a possibility in those countries, especially, in the Western Hemisphere. It seems like the United States would simply not allow that to happen violently. So is the model, right? Is Allende sort of a proof of concept of how one can get to socialism through electoral democracy? And he's the first real, believing Marxist that's elected through a democratic process. And he does have this ultimate agenda to actually get to something that looks more like a Soviet-style planned economy. It's a longer-term plan because it's not going to be enforced by violence, but it is the goal. And so for the Soviets, this is a very important test case of, is there an actual parliamentary path? And if there is a parliamentary path, right, this opens up a whole new strategy for Latin America and Western Europe. So it's a very important case.
Yeah, and it also it's quite interesting because I was quite surprised to see the sort of the party names almost switched, right? Because you have the Communist Party that are actually more moderate than the Socialist Party, and I mean, as you say, one of the reasons you've included it is this rejection of violent revolution. However, this is not a done deal within the leftist electoral coalition or pact, right? That this is still something that's quite a tense issue.
Right. And this is something that, in another way, again, this also sort of parallels a lot of what is happening in the West at this time. You think about the 60s and 70s, and you think about how, the French Communist Party in 1968, right, in May of 68 in Paris, when the government is nearly overthrown, the French communists are really behind the events, right? They're not the most radical. The most radical are, various kinds of groups that identify as Maoist or Trotskyite or something else. The French Communist Party is seen as more staid and institutional. This is certainly true in the United States, where the Communist Party is far smaller, but where, the radical left in the 1960s, again, they hold up pictures of, Che Guevara or Mao Zedong or Ho Chi Minh, but nobody's holding up pictures of Brezhnev or Kosygin, right, in Berkeley or Michigan in the 1960s. And so, this is a story that's really happening, and it's not an accident that the communist parties have become sort of more institutionalized. They're more tied to labor unions, which are also, sort of increasingly middle-class institutions in the West in the 1960s. They're taking orders from Moscow in many cases, and Moscow, its official policy is peaceful coexistence. It's not violent confrontation, and so that's their policy. And so it really is the case that most of the West, right, the radical left has gone beyond certainly Soviet-style communism to embrace, various figures like Che Guevara and others. And then you think, later on in the 1970s about, groups like the Baader-Meinhof Gang, the Red Army faction, the Weathermen in the United States, and they're all Maoist, various different types, and this happens in Chile as well. So the Communist Party is very, very loyal to Moscow, probably considered the most loyal communist party in South America. The socialists have their leanings both towards China and Cuba, and then to the left of the socialists, there's this leftist revolutionary movement. Who is, in part, who's one of the key members, actually Allende's daughter, who's having an affair with a Cuban intelligence officer at the Cuban embassy, who's, helping funnel weapons to this leftist revolutionary movement. And they're constantly a thorn in Allende's side as well, because, they don't wait they're suspicious of the socialist government. They don't wait for, cues from the government as to, for example, whether or not to, seize lands or, displace landowners. They act on their own when they don't think the government's acting fast enough. And so you have this, this same sort of dilemma you have elsewhere. So part of what the Soviets are learning, right, is not just, can you bring socialism to power through parliamentary means vis-a-vis the bourgeoisie, but can you also control the far left, right? It's a way of proving to the far left that, yes, you can do this through parliamentary means, and you don't have to do it through, violent means. You don't have to grab rifles and go to the mountains to make this happen. So really the Soviets are trying to prove this model, to both the right and the left. It's a two-sided battle.
Yeah, and this is like one of the tensions that we see, where there doesn't really seem to be this, shall we say, defined. I mean, this is something that's pointed out by the East Germans, I think, in particular, is there is not this defined economic or even like a practical plan, because there's a lot of sort of influence trading and appeasing going on that breaks from the original plan, right? I mean, because one of the big things that stands out is a discussion about the size of farmland that's going to be nationalised, and the size of businesses and this sort of thing, which seems to be quite relatively conservative at the start. It's not a we're going to seize everything overnight and good luck, like a sort of cultural revolution. And I mean, and this I think is one of the reasons why that there are these lessons learned, right? Is that there is this lack of defined plan.
Well, we talked about ideology, and I think you mentioned the farmland thing. It's one of the most interesting ways, I think, in which you sort of see what seemed like incredibly abstruse ideological disagreements turn out to have very concrete policy outcomes. So the disagreement over how many stages that the revolution had, And this really sounds like the kind of thing that that you sit around at 3 o'clock in the morning in a university dorm room discussing the stages of revolution, right? And yet, right, this directly bears on policy because if you believe that the revolution essentially only has one stage, like first we come to power through electoral politics, and then there's the Civil War. And that we come through the Civil War. Or if you believe that no, first we have to build a coalition, bring the middle classes over to our side, create a dominant political coalition, and then we move towards socialism. There's an extra stage in there. So this changes your land reform policy because the communists are saying our goal is first to bring the middle classes over to our side, right? To build a larger coalition to make sure that we win the presidential election in 1976. So therefore, we want to only expropriate the biggest landlords, but we don't want to expropriate the middle class because we want to get them on our side. We want to look like we're just, attacking the rich. And so they want, to expropriate land over 80 hectares, which leaves the middle class in possession of their estates. Meanwhile, the socialists are saying, no, what we have to prepare for civil war as soon as possible, which means we have to mobilize, right, the poorest elements of the peasantry to be ready to fight. And so to do that, right, we have to expropriate all land over 40 hectares because we're expropriating the middle class too. We want to mobilize and arm, the poor because, we're not waiting to have a presidential election in 1976. We're waiting for civil war in 1973 or 1974. And so, that discussion over how many stages to the revolution leads to a direct disagreement over, how big of a piece of land we should be expropriating.
Yeah, and there's another element towards the end of this, right, where there are these echoes and lessons learned from other things. And I mean, this was covered in another relatively recent book by Vincent Bevins, The Jakarta Method, where you start to see references to these anti-communist purges appearing in Santiago. And I mean, it's obviously what you've written is a historical book, but it really has these quite gripping elements. And I mean, when you get into the late stages where there's this almost an arms race between the various factions and nobody really knows what it's doing and it's all very anarchic. And obviously with the benefit of hindsight, where it can be like face palming, we're like, what are you guys doing? Like, just sort of get your act together. We see this sort of thing. And obviously, one of the key things about Chile is the role of the constitution, right? And this is one of the things that Allende is respecting. And in Chile, one of the things we also see is the role of the military and its link to the constitution. And unfortunately for Allende, that's this element he doesn't really see coming, right?
Yes, well, I mean, one of the reasons it seemed like there was a possibility for success in Chile was precisely the fact that the military had not interfered in Chilean politics for so long. And this made Chile relatively exceptional in Latin America, right? If you compare it to Argentina or Brazil or Peru or other places. And so it seemed like because the military would respect, the constitutional government and the result of elections, therefore you wouldn't have to worry about a socialist government being overthrown militarily. And that, that turned out to be, again, tragically wrong in Chile. But it was essentially one of the conditions for success, right? This is a reason why this seemed like a potentially promising experiment. And that's why, right, there was so much hope invested in Chile, was because it had this history. And then it turned out by the 1970s, 1980s, where you have this sort of southern cone of Latin America, military regimes in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile.
Yeah, and then we sort of see that, and obviously, as you said, Allende is the first elected, or democratically elected and very open Marxist. And as we've already talked about, we see these tensions because obviously Cuba is seen as a potential example of a more radical, non-party based revolutionary violence that succeeds. And then Allende is trying his own thing. And then the next country we get to in the book is interesting, and I suspect probably one that most people don't know that much about, is Tanzania. And this comes out quite interestingly because it explicitly and almost to its detriment at times, its sort of unwillingness to engage with Marxist notions of socialism, and instead pursues a very different path.
Well, so I picked Tanzania in part because there's a lot of discourse around different kinds of socialism at this period of time. There's African socialism, Arab socialism, and the reason these socialisms are qualified is because their attempts to dissociate the socialist programs of these countries from the Soviet Union and from kind of the Stalinist model or the Maoist model, and the idea of collectivization and class struggle and purges and famine and such. And so these were attempts to dissociate them. This is a different sort of model, and the key to what was called African socialism. And I picked Tanzania in part because Tanzania really is kind of the most coherent, persistent attempt to implement African socialism in practice. The key element of African socialism is the idea that Africa does not have classes and therefore does not have class struggle in the classical Marxist sense. The idea is that it was only Western imperialists who introduced kind of class differentiation and introduced these sorts of divisions. And so once the Western imperialists were driven out, classes disappeared. The bourgeoisie were gone. They left. And so Africa instead has these communalist traditions that preceded Western imperialism that could be resurrected after the Western imperialists leave. And these communalist traditions can be the basis for a direct transition to socialism without having to have class warfare. Class warfare is seen as being, very divisive, very violent, and precisely at a time when you have a post-colonial state that is trying to, create national coherence, right, and build political institutions and create a national identity. The last thing you want to do is essentially attack your own elite, because you need the elite, right? You need your cities, you need your elite because you're trying to build this country. And so there was, the reasons why they wanted to avoid class struggle. And so Tanzania's experiment in socialism really is, okay, well, if you don't have class struggle and you don't embrace Marxist ideology, then how do you do this, right? How do you, and it would turn out, right, that, instead of attracting foreign investment and trying to build domestic industry that way, you want to do self-reliance through African communalist methods. Well, that basically means that you have to develop an agricultural surplus, export that surplus, and get capital that way for investment. And it's a very difficult path to attempt to navigate because it's very slow and it relies heavily on terms of trade, and terms of trade are turning against Tanzania at that point, especially once you reach the oil shock of the 1970s, and all of a sudden Tanzania is paying a lot more for imports than it paid for exports, and so it's difficult to do this. But they did this in part because they're not willing to embrace Marxist class struggle ideology and therefore sort of join the Soviet camp and get their aid complete from the Soviet Union. Because that would not only would it lead to domestic political upheaval, but it would also mean basically giving up their hard-won independence, becoming dependent on an outside power. And that's the last thing they wanted to do right after achieving independence, is basically become enthralled to another imperialist power, this time in Moscow or in Beijing.
And it's interesting because it's another one of these countries that we see this sort of two-way pull, right? Like at the start, it's like pre-independence and post-independence, it's far from the most radical country. It doesn't have the same level of settlement as, say, somewhere like what was then Rhodesia or Kenya. And I mean, it doesn't even exist like Tanzania doesn't even exist as a country at independence. You obviously have the Omani influenced former Sultanate of Zanzibar, or as it will be the former Sultanate of Zanzibar, and then you have what was Tanganyika, who have very different, though geographically close, very different sort of cultural and historical backgrounds. And I mean, even the leader is far from a firebrand. It's not like a Mandela who tones things down. In fact, it's actually the opposite way on. He starts off quite mellow and ends up ratcheting it up, right?
Yes, well, actually, this is why both the Soviets and the Chinese were so slow to embrace socialism in Tanzania. They looked at Nyerere. Nyerere is someone who seems, he worked closely with the British in the last years of colonialism. He specifically emphasizes, right, that we have to have a place for both white European settlers and South Asian immigrants in our society, and they have to have a place in the legislature. And the Chinese actually criticize him for being "quote unquote" non-racist, right, in the sense that if he should be the kind of person who wants to push the whites out of Africa, and that's what they mean by racism. And they criticize him for being non-racist, for being willing to accept the role of different ethnicities, different races in Tanzanian society. And so they're very suspicious of the fact that he's not militant and he's not radical. And yet he sort of becomes radicalized between 1961 and 1967. It's interesting, there are a number of reasons why this happens. And one is a series of sort of hostile encounters with the West, with the British, with the Americans, with the West Germans. So the British are seen as supporting people inside the government who are trying to sort of slow his policies. They also, are the ones who train the military, which will ultimately mutiny against Nyerere in 1964. The Americans are seen as plotting against him. The West Germans are trying to, control his policy by telling him he can't recognize East Germany. So a series of hostile encounters with the West pushes him in that direction. At the same time, he did have a socialist, view, but what was called, a Fabian socialist view, kind of, older-fashioned English nonviolent version of socialism, which he studied in the UK in the 1940s, and he came to realize that it would take a more radical disruption for members of Tanzanian society, even in the ruling party, to adopt any sort of socialism, because the ruling party was necessarily made up of, local chiefs, local landowners, people who had a stake in the status quo and didn't really want disruption. On top of that, you had a lot of Western trained bureaucrats. And so he began to understand that if you actually are going to move towards socialism, you do have to disrupt this. And that means, first of all, transforming, the ruling party. So instead of changing the membership, what he does, he will actually just, insist that everybody divest themselves of their land holdings and their businesses and everything else. But he realized that you're not getting anywhere unless you push for greater disruption, and so that's why, right? He sort of became radicalized both through international and through domestic political forces between 61 and 67.
I mean, think this is the domestic element as well is something that came as a surprise to me. And I was familiar with people like Walter Rodney, who had been based at the University of Dar es Salaam, but I wasn't aware that it was this sort of intellectual hot pot for quite a wide range of views, right? There's some very radical left scholars, and as you say, there's more this traditional gradualist, Fabian, reformist, some English scholars coming in. I mean, I think if people are familiar with sort of these outposts of sort of socialist discussion and leftist thought, they're probably more familiar with Algiers or somewhere like that in this time, and Dar es Salaam's a little bit different. And as you said, this internal element also becomes a pull. So it's a rejection of the West, and it's sort of telling him what to do, which he doesn't take kindly to. And then there is also this internal development, and he plays with it a bit, right? He doesn't like quite a lot of, shall we say, older style socialist leaders would reject that radicalism and eventually be swept up in it or eradicate it, and it'd be a problem, which is what we see sort of with Allende a bit. But in this situation, he sort of integrates it and works with it, right? And this is one of the key things, is where the Chinese really start to come in at this time as well.
Well, the interesting thing is that the Chinese, it seems, in a number of these cases, including Chile and Tanzania as well, the Chinese are at the most radical phase, right? This really is the Cultural Revolution in China. And so, given sort of the radicalism of the approach in China, they don't really take seriously the socialist programs of people like Allende or Nyerere, who, to their mind, right, are not nearly radical enough to be taken seriously as socialist. That socialism, it must involve violence. It must involve, social upheaval. And the people who are trying to get to socialism by avoiding violence and social upheaval are therefore deluding themselves, or, tools of capitalists. And so the Chinese have a close relationship with Nyerere, but it's basically an anti-imperialist relationship. It's a relationship built on the idea that, he's a bastion of anti-imperialism in Africa. And you mentioned, the University of Dar es Salaam. So, I mean, the political sort of geography of Tanzania is very interesting. The University of Dar es Salaam is on a hill 8 kilometers west of the center of government. And so there's this perpetual fear. On the one hand, there's this, radical Western intellectuals. You mentioned Walter Rodney. There's John Saul. There's a lot of different kinds of people who, will ultimately write many, many books about Tanzania later on because they were so involved in the University of Dar es Salaam at the time. At the same time, you also have, the ANC, Frelimo, the MPLA, right? All the sort of liberation movements of Southern Africa are have training camps in Tanzania. That's their rear base, especially Mozambique. But the ANC famously has training camps there as well. And so you have, this other sort of presence of radicalism. That's the one the Chinese were interested in, really, is, the Tanzania as the locus of the Southern African liberation movement, those fighting the colonialist regimes or the apartheid regimes. So in that sense, right, that's where their interest in Tanzania really comes from. But Nyerere does, right, I mean, the process of radicalization doesn't really stop for him until, mid 1970s at the earliest. Because as you say, right, there's pressure from the West and there's resistance to that. There's internal pressures. And he keeps, realizing the depths of internal pressure more and more until the point which, he really begins to listen more and more to those in the University of Dar es Salaam and those pushing the party further left. And so, it's 1973 is really the culmination of that, when he orders full villagization, realizing that his efforts at voluntary socialism are not bearing fruit. But the Chinese don't really, even though they're still in 1973, they're still in Tanzania in massive numbers building the Tazara Railway. They never really come to embrace Nyerere's model of socialism the way the Soviets do.
Well, I mean, this false villagization. I mean, the scale of that was another thing that surprised me. I think is it 70% of the population we see moved, and you say there were instances of violence, but compared to, say, the Cultural Revolution, it was not a violent thing. And yeah, this role of China, which, as you say, goes back to this differing views of socialism, right? It's viewed through a prism, and there's this thing. I mean, skipping back a little bit, another thing that surprised me as well, though not entirely new, was how China had much less of an issue carrying on relations with Pinochet, who was this obviously a very clear anti-communist, and I'm sure that would come as a surprise to many again. But going back to Tanzania, there is this massive shift, and I think it's probably of all the examples in the book, it's probably one of the more obvious styles of trying to adapt to local circumstances, right? And we see that very differently when we come to Angola. I mean, and the chapter on Angola opens with a quote from the leader of the MPLA, who explicitly distances himself from African socialism as well as Asian socialism and Spanish socialism, because he says there is no such thing, there is only socialism.
Yeah, exactly. So as I was saying, right, there was this movement in the developing world for, different kinds of socialism, right? Arab socialism, African socialism, Latin American socialism. And the Angolan leadership, when they come into power in 1975, the MPLA, they basically say, look, these are all, attempts at really avoiding, the only way that socialism can work, which is the proper Marxist-Leninist model. So they sort of saw these as mistaken heresies, in the same way the Soviets initially saw them as kind of, heretical movements. The initial Soviet reaction to these versions of socialism in the 1960s was that these are ways for, bourgeois reformists to blunt pressures for a socialist revolution by appropriating the term socialism to refer to really non-socialist things. That's how they saw this, in the early 1960s. They came around, right? The very fact that they decided to support Nyerere proves that they had evolved past that by the late 1960s. But then, Nyerere fails, and socialism in Tanzania fails. And so they take that as a lesson that this is, not a successful path. And so when the Angolan leadership comes in, they've decided that this was a failed path, African socialism. And now it's time to implement real Marxist-Leninism in Africa, which means industrialization, which means, class struggle, which means formal alliance with the socialist camp, and which means, a political structure of, a Leninist party, organized on the same, principles with, a central committee and different departments and a Politburo, a similar kind of party, a party of, revolutionary vanguard party, as it's called, which, relies heavily on a security apparatus, a large military and intelligence organization and police organization, and that, this is how it worked in the USSR. This is how it worked in Eastern Europe, and this is the same model, how it worked in Cuba, and this is how it's going to have to work in Africa. So it's this rejection of these sort of alternative paths in favor of the tried and true model, at least in the political sense.
I mean, at the same time, there is this, as you say, this exporting of the model, and it's in a way you could say it's almost a return to sort of a purism. However, another thing that we do see throughout the book is this back and forth between these countries and the Soviets and the Chinese about aid and about support, and sometimes that's a cause of worry because the Chinese are helping and the Soviets aren't, or the Soviets are and the Chinese aren't. But in Angola, it sort of seems like the Soviet sort of patience for that has maybe run a little bit thin, right? Because it opens up, and it's within the first few pages of the chapter in Angola, we talk about how the Soviets encourage private capital, whether foreign or domestic, to invest heavily in the minerals. However, as you say, a key part of that is there needs to be this Marxist-Leninist party that has a strict hold on power. But this idea that private capital will fuel industrialization and then lead to a revolution is quite bizarre, I imagine, for many people who have this orthodox idea of Marxism as this anti-capital, anti-business view.
Right. So as I say, right, it's a return to orthodoxy in a political sense, but not really in an economic sense. And that's a key distinction, because if you look at the trajectory of Soviet involvement in the developing world, it shifts from sort of exporting Stalinism to then exporting Leninism. The idea in the early 1960s was that first you transform the economy. If we have mass industrialization and we do it through state-led development, that will create a working class. Working class will create a political party. You sort of, through changing the economic situation, you will change the social and political reality. And that was the approach in the early 1960s, right? That's why, massive state-led investment in industrialization, kind of like, Stalin in the 1930s, that was the program. And that was seen to have failed for a number of reasons. First of all, the investments didn't necessarily work. The political leadership was not willing to allow themselves to be replaced by, communists and so on and so forth. So the idea of changing the material economy first as a way of changing the politics was seen to have failed. So instead, they reversed the situation. And this, in certain ways, is almost a reverse, right, of kind of Marxist materialist determination. So instead, what they do is they say, well, we control the political situation first, right? Institute, make sure that a communist party, something that looks, that is ideologically correct, ideologically pure, is in charge of the political power. Make sure they have the ability to enforce that, right, through the security apparatus. And once the political situation is secure, then we can be more experimental with the economic situation. So first of all, this has the benefit of removing the burden from the USSR, right, of having to provide all that aid. It's not as expensive for them if you can attract foreign direct investment instead of Soviet government aid. But it also means that the idea is that, look, these economies are not going to be developed through state-led development. There's not enough capital. It's also not how it happened elsewhere. So what we have is we have to have essentially like supervised capitalist development. That capitalism is good at developing the means of production. And so we need capitalist development and capitalist investment. But we can't allow the capitalist economic structures to impact the political structure. And so as long as we have trusted Marxist-Leninists in firm control of the political situation, we can allow foreign direct investment to happen without worrying that that's going to transform the political structures. That's the idea, basically supervised capitalist development. And what this leads to in Angola, and not just in Angola, but Angola is a very particular situation. Angola has this, it leads to an absurd situation in Angola where you actually have Cuban troops defending Gulf Oil, an American oil company, against American armed UNITA guerrillas who are fighting the regime. So again, Cuban troops defending an American oil company against American-backed guerrillas, right? That's where this ends up in Angola, which is kind of a geopolitical absurdity, but it's a logical outcome of the situation in which you have capitalism at the service of communism in a political sense. And so what this ends up with is, because you want the growth, but you want it controlled politically, the most logical thing to do is say, well, the party should control not just the politics, but also the economy. And so in Angola, you have a state oil company, Sonangol, which is also then run by key MPLA leaders, because who can you trust, to be the capitalists better than, the social leaders themselves? And so you have this marriage of political and economic power in a place like Angola, which is still the case, right? The MPLA to this day has never given up power, has never lost an election, and the leaders of the Angolan economy are still key, figures tied to the leadership of the MPLA. So you've had the situation where you basically have this sort of, Leninist petrostate which was not an accident. It was created on purpose because of the idea that supervised capitalism can only happen if the capital is in trusted hands.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that some listeners might be drawing comparisons perhaps with later times, maybe in China, where you've got this notion of like the commanding heights of the economy and harnessing the productive forces. It's quite interesting to hear this happening almost in a separate occurrence on a very different continent, in a very different situation. And I think what's also interesting, and this is something that once again I didn't know anything about until I read the book, is another attractive element of the Leninist model for the MPLA is linked to race, and this seems to be a big thing because initially they're not even seen as nobody's really placing any bets on them as a horse in this race. They are not the most popular group, right? There's 3 or more different factions who shift across the spectrum, but these are not the favorites.
Right. So, I mean, race has always been an Achilles heel of the MPLA, and it certainly was during the liberation struggle. And the reason is that, there was a lot of Portuguese settlement in Angola, and there was, there were many mixed marriages. And those who were most privileged in Angolan society tended to be, the white European settlers and their descendants. And they were certainly privileged over the native Africans. And the MPLA is mostly an organization of those who had somewhat of a more privileged upbringing, those who were able to go to Luanda, or not Luanda, to Lisbon or to Paris to study. And, those were usually the wealthier urban, mixed race or white Angolans. And so the MPLA really was a movement that took hold among whites and mixed race peoples, of the more privileged segment of Angolan society. And so if, for communists, this is largely irrelevant at the time, right? The real identity is class-based. Everything else, as I said, is epiphenomenal, race and ethnicity and nation and such. And so class cleavages don't really matter. But for most Angolans, as for many, most Africans, or for that matter, probably most people in the colonial world full stop, oppression was seen first and foremost in racial terms. That, it was these white Europeans who are the oppressors, not, the bourgeoisie or the ruling class, right? This is, it's not about who holds the means of production. It's simply about, first and foremost about, racial identity, right? That's the easiest way to identify your oppressors. And so the MPLA always had this problem that, well, they were also white or they were also mixed race. And if liberation meant anything to most people in Angola, it meant that, there would not be white people ruling them anymore. And so this was a problem for the MPLA. It was also a problem for the Soviet Union, because the Soviets were trying to sell a story of oppression as being fundamentally about class in a region in which oppression was seen as being about race. And they were always in danger of being accused of, being white imperialists, just like, the British or the French or the Portuguese or somebody else. And this was a story the Chinese told very often about the Soviets, that the Soviets don't really care about you. The Soviets are willing to peacefully coexist with the West precisely because the Soviets are also racist white imperialists who don't care about, peoples of color around the world. And so it was a vulnerability both for the MPLA and for the Soviet Union. And so the fact that, the MPLA, ultimately you have as leader Agostinho Neto, who is fully African and is black. And, it was very important that he not be replaced by one of his key lieutenants, like Lucio Lara or Mario Andrade or someone else who was not fully African. There was always a fear of, who his successor would be. But it was back to the fact that Neto was a black African who was, perpetually talking about how oppression is a matter of class and not about race, that made him, so convenient to the Soviet Union, right? It made him, a useful ally, someone, a black face who had their ideology, their non-racist ideology. And they were especially vulnerable to attack on this. So, the FNLA and UNITA, who were the other 2 major liberation movements, were both attacking the MPLA for being, not African. And at the same time, there were perpetual mutinies inside the MPLA, led by people like, Daniel Chipenda, especially in 1973-74, the famous Revolta do Leste, arguing that, the MPLA was privileging this sort of, what were called mestizos, mixed race elites over, local Africans. And it doesn't really end with independence, right? It ends in a certain sense with this massive purge in 1977 of the followers of a guy named Nito Alves, who sort of rebelled against the MPLA leadership. And ironically, it was a Pyrrhic victory, because what happened is, for most of the MPLA rank and file, they saw the mestizos as the enemy. And so kind of the Nitista orthodoxy became motivating, behind the purge that followed the repression of Alves. So the MPLA never really escaped this. And it's always made them very vulnerable, right? Vulnerable to attack of being, not really pure Angolan for this reason. And so it had this, it had this weird effect of, on the one hand, making them more useful to the Soviet Union, and at the same time making their rule, more fragile in Angola, which always necessitated, more oppression and a more closed regime.
And I'm aware that we're coming towards the ends of the time, and I don't want to miss out on Iran. And Iran is another example of this, I suppose, what we'd now talk about as terms of like intersectionality, right? It is the intersection of class, and in the instance of Angola, it's race and or ethnic group. I mean, that's one of the other key issues in Angola. But in Iran, it's very different. I mean, when we talk about the Iranian Revolution, it is... I mean, and obviously the premise of the book is to reassess what we think of as revolutions or as socialism, but the Iranian Revolution, as a sort of theocratic based victory for literal clerics, obviously underpinned with some sort of messages of social justice that draw upon like Shia framings of oppression and the discussions about Imam Ali and the sort of the justice coming from that. It still is not somewhere most people would consider as leftist, unless you were just doing broad strokes of everybody that's anti-American.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. I think most people, when they look at the Islamic Republic of Iran, and of course, the kind of the superficial reading of it is that this is a sort of return to some sort of medieval theocracy. That this is, it's a reversion in some way. It's kind of almost like a pre-modern form of government and the return of religion and power. And I think that's misreading it completely. I think that what's interesting about the Islamic Republic is that if you understand sort of the trial and error process, the evolution of socialism in the developing world, as I discussed throughout the book, you see how this is a product of that evolution. And it wouldn't have been possible. You couldn't have had the Islamic Republic of Iran in the 1920s or in the 1940s. It becomes possible only through this process. And that is because, as you begin to adapt socialism to the post-colonial context, and you begin to adapt discourses of identity, discourses of ethnicity and race and nationalism and religion, right? Then you sort of mix these things. And so, what the Islamic Republic of Iran really is it's a creation of this process. So you have, right, throughout the 1960s and 1970s, especially, in the wake of the 1967 Six-Day War, you have kind of the collapse of the socialist model in the Middle East, of the idea, along with Pan-Arabism. And this plays on other critiques of socialism that had already been present, especially in Iran. So Iran always had a very strong socialist presence and a strong socialist party. In the 1940s and 1950s, the Tudeh is the largest party in Iran, and they are basically the Communist Party. And what happens is that, socialism becomes discredited. It seemed to have failed, right? It failed to bring economic development. It failed to bring economic justice, and it also failed to bring dignity and restoration on the international stage, right? And that was what was really symbolic, especially in '67. Right? It failed to restore the place of these Middle Eastern states and the post-colonial states more broadly, right, to their position of international dignity and independence vis-a-vis the West and the imperial powers. And so socialism is actually, or Islamism is a replacement for socialism in the sense that, it makes the claim, and this goes back to, Ayatollah Talabani, who's, the Imam Jum'ah of the major mosque in Tehran in the 1940s, at a time when most of the youth of Tehran is attracted to socialism through the Tudeh party. He actually adapts Islamism to say that Islamism can do what socialism claims to do, but it can do it better. Islam can provide social justice. Islam can provide economic development. Islam can provide, anti-imperialism and national dignity and national self-assertion. And so it's a response to the failure of socialism, and it's enabled by the very fact that socialism is now adapting, religious discourses, ethnic discourses, nationalist discourses. And so that's why, right, not only does the Islamic Republic come to power, but it comes to power with the alliance of the left, right? The Tudeh, at the urging of the Soviets and the East Germans, supports Khomeini in his path to power precisely because they see him, right, as the true anti-imperialist leader of the revolution. And of course, they believe that, the reason they adapt religious nationalist, ethnic discourses is because they believe that these things are epiphenomenal and ultimately will disappear. But the thing is, first you have to get people on board, and you get them on board with these discourses, and then you get them to, no longer feel these discourses are important. And then down the road, they begin to understand that really it's all about economics and it's all about class, and the stuff about, nationalism and religion or whatever wasn't important. And so they figure that, support Khomeini, in 6 months, 2 years down the road, right, once people realize that, religious leaders can't run an economy, then power will fall into our hands, right? The religious authorities can't possibly run a country in the modern world. And of course, 40 years later, right, they're still in power. Well, the Soviet Union is gone. But that was the idea, right? So they actually, not only did they set the stage for the rise of Islamism to power, but they actually helped it along politically.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is obviously especially relevant in contemporary discourse as well, where we see these sort of these third world or less developed world or global south alliances emerging, and obviously sometimes that can be problematic because you can see clashes, say, with LGBT rights in the Western left and possibly more or less tolerant views amongst the global south. And while we're talking about contemporary things, and as we sort of draw things to a close, can I ask what what's in the pipeline next? Is it that chapter on Nicaragua?
It's not a chapter on Nicaragua per se, but one of the projects that I would like to work on is a book on sort of the new left in the West in global context from the 1960s towards the end of the Cold War. And there are many reasons for this, but you mentioned Nicaragua, and I think, I do think there is socialism as this global process. And if you look at, the reemergence of socialism in the West, we think now about Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn and, AOC and people like that. And this traces back to the 2016 campaign, and before that to Occupy Wall Street. And before that, kind of its major sort of, coming out party was really sort of the WTO protests in Seattle, I think about 1999 and 2000, when it became, anti-globalization. So where was it, right? Between, we remember, the Red Army faction and the Weatherman in the 1970s, and then all of a sudden, right, it's back in 1999. Where was it in between? And part of that answer is, if you think about it as a global process, where it was in part in Latin America. That's where kind of the most productive, most sort of fertile socialist political, and intellectual thought was in the 80s and 90s. And Nicaragua is a key element of that, right? So I think, part of the story, so there will be, so I'm not going to write a chapter on Nicaragua in the way that I wrote in this book, but Latin America will play a very important role in that story about, how, the global context in which the new left in the West moves from where it was in the 1960s and it's sort of divorced from the old left, and how it set the stage for the kind of return of the left that we now have in the West right now. So that's the project that I would like to work on. At least involves somewhat less research in Moscow, so that might be more feasible. But I'm sort of, now we're coming out of COVID, it might be time to hit the archives again.
I mean, that sounds incredible, and I think it's wonderful that it still fits in with this bigger pattern, as you say, of this evolution and development, as well as this reassessment of what, looking beyond these tick box list ideas of socialism. So on that note, I really want to thank you for joining us today and for writing this wonderful book. I've recommended it to many friends, and I'm sure our listeners will be very interested in it. I mean, we've discussed it quite a lot today, but I mean, there's a lot of detail, and I was very impressed in how it doesn't overwhelm. It can be quite hard, especially with ideological and political and economic sort of developments, just to not throw facts, and that has happened in other books I've read. And this navigates that tightrope quite well without dumbing things down. So, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for the book.
Thank you very much, Thomas.